One of the options you have when creating a component is Always Face Camera. If that's checked, we refer to the component as a Face Me component, because it always faces the camera, no matter what point of view you have. This has an implication on shadows, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Face Me components are best made in a side view, in elevation. So here I'm going to delete this object and press Command 3 to go in the front view. I'll also press J to go into parallel projection mode, so I'm looking at an elevation. I'm going to create a piece of entourage, that is, a person that we can put into our scene that will always face the camera, so that we don't blow the illusion and see the person edge on, revealing that they're actually mapped to a plane. Use the rectangle tool and create a rectangle in the general shape of a person. I'll make it 3 feet wide and 6 feet high, and then zoom in. Double-click to select the face and its edges, press G to define it as a component. I'll call this Person, and check Always Face Camera. I'll click Create, and let's see what we have. Press J to go into perspective, and then orbit around, and you'll see that as you rotate, the plane always faces the camera no matter what. It does this by rotating around the blue axis, and it does that at its insertion point, which is down here in this corner by default. Typically with Entourage, you want to have them rotate about their center point. So we're going to have to move that over in the component definition. You can move the axes over in an existing component by right-clicking and saying Change Axes. This doesn't refer to the axes of space. Rather, it's the local coordinate system of the component. I'll click the midpoint along the lower edge to define this insertion point. And then the red axis should be along the edge, and strangely enough, the green axis should stay on the ground. So I'm going to click again on the red axis to locate that, just as it was before. Now I need to go ahead and insert an instance of this component. So I'll open the Components window, and there's our Person component. Notice that it's attached to the cursor at this new insertion point. I'll click it at the origin point here, and you can see what's happening. Now that you understand the mechanics of a Face Me component, let's actually build a real one, and we'll just start from scratch. It's necessary to leave SketchUp temporarily and go over to Photoshop, where we have a texture. This image comes to us courtesy of iStock Photo, and it's part of my Photoshop for Architects CS3 Extended Edition DVD. In that DVD, I show how to extract the figure from the ground, and I end up making this layer mask right here. Basically, we want to have the pixels representing the person as the only thing in this file. Everything else is transparent. That way, when we composite it into the Face Me component in SketchUp, we'll just be looking at the person, and we can put them in front of a building, and it will look like they're standing there. So I saved this on my hard drive just as a native Photoshop document, a PSD file. I'll switch back to SketchUp, and let's build the component. Switch to the front view by pressing Command 3, and press J to go into parallel projection mode. Recreate the rectangle, and make it 3 feet by 6 feet, and then zoom in. Press B to activate the Paint Bucket tool. If you're on the Mac, you have to click the brick symbol to access your library. Right-click in this area and say New Texture. You're prompted to select a file. Here we have the businesswoman.psd file. I'll open that. And then I'm prompted to set a width and a height. Let's say she's about 5'5". That sounds about right. I'll click OK. And the texture has been created, but it's at the bottom of this list. I need to scroll down. Click the texture, and then click on the screen. Notice that we can see the sky through here, because we're looking at transparent pixels on this image. Textures tile or repeat by default in 2 directions, so we need to do something about that. I'll select this edge and use the Move tool to move it in, thereby cropping out the copy of the person. Press the space bar and pre-select the top edge. Move it down in the same way. Now, I don't want to see these solid lines every time I have this piece of entourage, so I'm going to double-click and then hold down Shift and deselect the face. Press H to hide the edges. And now to define the component, double-click to select the face and its hidden edges. press G to define the component. I'll call it woman, always face camera, and set component axes. Just click this button to do that directly while you're defining the component. I'll set the insertion point right here at the midpoint of the lower edge. And then I need to pick a point for the red axis and a point for the green axis. Now the green axis should actually be on the ground, just as it was previously. So I'll click over here. Create. And there we have it. Now that we've successfully created the FaceMe component, let's place it in the context of a project. To do this, I'll actually delete this instance. I don't have to worry about losing it because it's stored within SketchUp's database within this file. I can call for that component whenever I need it in the Components window. I'll unhide the building, which is in this file, and zoom out to look at it. I'll go into Perspective mode and zoom in on this outdoor courtyard area. Then I'll open the Components window, click on the entourage that we just created, and place her in this space. So now she'll look good no matter what orientation we're looking at, because this plane always faces the camera, and so we never blow this illusion of having a photographic texture mapped onto a plane. Before we conclude, there's one other thing I'd like to mention about shadows. I'm going to select this component and just open up the component dialog. If you're creating a FaceMe component, the default option is to have the shadows face the sun, and this is generally a good idea. Let me just show you what that looks like. I'll open up the Shadows dialog here and display shadows. So right now you see that the shadow is going this way, the same direction as all the other shadows. And as they orbit around, that relationship does not change. This is a good thing, because if the shadows didn't face the sun, they'd be facing this thin plane, and we'd be getting sort of weird shadows. Unfortunately, the shadow that is cast is rectangular. SketchUp isn't smart enough to create the shadow based on the transparency here. So the workaround for that is to use components that are cut out around the edges. And we can see those examples in the component window. Here's an example right here. This is actually a cutout. We can place it here. And you see that when I turn on the shadows, this will cast an accurate shadow because the object is actually cut out here. These are edges all the way around. So you do have the option of going around this figure with the freehand tool and creating myriad edges that trace around her. And only then would you get an accurate shadow on the ground. There is a way to do this using Photoshop, Illustrator, and SketchUp Pro, but it's probably overkill in most situations.